Can you imagine not being able to choose the seat on your bus because of your ethnicity? For a long period of time, African Americans were denied many of their civil rights due to their ethnicity. Fortunately, for African Americans, a man arose that would forever change America. At a young age, he made many stands for African American civil rights that finally led to his assassination, and his name was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It has been 43 years since Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, but his vision for equality started a civil rights movement that continues today and guarantees rights to all Americans despite race, creed, or color. All of the information today comes from the books I May Not Get There With You, The True Story of Martin Luther King Jr. by Michael Eric Dyson, and Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference by David J. Garrow, and the official website of the Nobel Peace Prize, www.nobelprize.org. Most people take their civil rights for granted, but African Americans were denied their civil rights until Martin Luther King Jr. stifled the nation with the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 was the beginning of Martin Luther King Jr.'s rise as an icon in the African American civil rights movement. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, an African American woman, was arrested for not giving up her seat on a bus, which was not the initial arrest. A black female that was pregnant was arrested 6 months earlier, but because of her social status, Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists didn't want to use her case because they didn't want to hurt the civil rights case any. So they went ahead and used Rosa Parks' arrest, which led to the bus boycott of 1955 and was headed by Martin Luther King. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted nearly 1 year, and Martin Luther King was arrested, threatened, and beaten during the boycott. Finally, after months of demonstrations, the boycott ended on December 21st, 1956, following the Browder versus Gale case, which made segregation on all Montgomery public transportation illegal. The Browder versus Gale ruling opened America's eyes to the civil injustices created and received by African Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. marched several times for the African American civil rights movement, but the march in 1963 was the most influential in the African American civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington in 1963 was vital to African American civil rights. King was among 10 civil rights leaders who spoke to a crowd of over 250,000 people at the Capitol in Washington. But King's "I Have a Dream" speech enamored the crowd and left all 250,000 people clamoring for equality. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech from Washington is known as one of the most influential speeches of all time and changed America's ideals. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was passed on July 2nd, 1964 was the United States answer to the civil rights demands of African Americans. The Civil Rights Act made voting equal for all races, ended racial segregation, and ensured equality in the workplace, and while allowing African Americans to finally utilize the civil rights promised to all Americans. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1955 Montgomery bus boycott and 1963 March on Congress were monumental events that all but forced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and solidified civil rights for African Americans throughout the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. was labeled an icon of the African American civil rights movement for his unwavering fight for equality despite false arrests, acts of violence, and political pressures. Martin Luther King Jr. predicted that his demand for equality would result in his assassination, which proved to be true when he was shot and killed in 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. dedicated his entire life to reform a nation. But what is truly amazing is this feat was accomplished before his 40th birthday. Thank you. I'd like to appreciate everybody for allowing me to come speak with you today. Have a good day.
Yes, sir. You too.